Hello, my name is Frank Hiley. In this talk, I will describe a scientific model of consciousness that explains spirituality and enlightened states. I originally presented these ideas at the April 2016 Science of Consciousness Conference in Tucson, Arizona. I am also the author of a forthcoming book on this same subject. The talk is outlined as follows. In part 1, I'll talk about agents in general and the three-agent model of the brain in particular. Then, in part 2, I will discuss a concept in neuroscience that I am calling the cluster of conscious neurons, followed by part 3 on spirituality and spiritual enlightenment. This section includes a description of the problem that spirituality solves, along with some of the properties of enlightenment that will be explained by this model. Then, in part 4, I'll be combining these ideas. In particular, adding the three-agent model to the cluster of conscious neurons concept to explain spirituality and spiritual enlightenment. I will conclude with part 5, where this model makes testable predictions. Next, part 1, agents and the three-agent model of the brain. Since humans and animals are the only examples we have of conscious entities, it is reasonable to require a conscious entity to be an agent. An agent has goals, a way of sensing the world, and a way to make changes to the world to achieve its goals. A theorem from control theory in 1970 says, any good agent must contain a model of the system. Therefore, all agents in our world must make models of our world. These may be a very simple model of the world that a worm might make, or they could be the very complex model of the world that human brains make. It follows that if the agent is part of the system, then the agent must also contain a model of itself. So in general, we can say that a conscious agent must contain a model of the world and a model of the agent itself. In other words, it needs a self-model. Now I'll talk about the three-agent model of the brain. In engineering, when creating a system, a common practice is to break up the design into multiple subsystems that perform different functions, which are then interconnected. Applying that technique to the human brain agent, I propose the hypothesis that there are 3 different but integrated functional agents in the brain. The first agent is the thinker. It encompasses the executive function, which uses language, symbols, concepts, and images to solve problems. The executive function is also known as the cognitive control or supervisory attention system. Executive functions include working memory, attentional control, inhibitory control, as well as problem-solving and planning capabilities. The succinct summary of all these capabilities is that the thinker is the problem-solving agent. The thinker in humans is much more powerful than the thinker in other animals or even primates. The significantly increased human thinker capabilities are due in large part to the enormous and accurate shared conceptual model of the world that humans have developed and exported using language. The increased human thinker capability is also due to the substantial increases in the size of the frontal lobes of the human brain compared to the great apes. The doer is the agent that controls the body and has emotions. The doer controls the body by controlling the muscles and glands of the body. The doer has built-in goals such as surviving and reproducing. Emotions and feelings can indicate the doer's success or failure at achieving these evolutionary goals. Of course, humans and animals share many feelings and emotions. The doer is the dominant agent in non-human animals. The experiencer is the agent that constructs the sensory and language or conceptual model of the world and the body. The experiencer supplies those models of the world and the body to the thinker and doer agents because every agent needs a model of the system it is controlling. I will often talk about the experiencer having both a representation and a model of the world. The term representation refers to the current state of the world, and the term model refers to the ability to predict new states of the world given some planned action plus the current state. Thus, the thinker and doer use the models of the experiencer to predict future states of the world, depending on the actions they plan to take in the world. The most compelling evidence for the thinker and doer agents is dual process theory in psychology. Dual process theory has conclusively demonstrated the existence of two different decision-making systems in humans, one that is fast and one that is slow. Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman popularized dual process theory in his 2011 book, Thinking Fast and Slow. DPT System 1, the fast subconscious system, is the doer. The other characteristics of the fast system are that it is automatic, frequently used, emotional, and stereotypical. DPT System 2, the slow conscious system, is the thinker. The other characteristics of the slow system are that it is effortful, infrequently used, logical, and calculating. It is important to note that the thinker is conscious and the doer is subconscious. I will now turn to the locations of the three agents in the brain. The occipital, temporal, and parietal lobes at the back of the brain implement the experiencer. These lobes include the primary sensory areas for vision, hearing, and body sensations. So the experiencer contains the sensory model of the world. These lobes also include Wernicke's area for language perception, and they include episodic and semantic memory. Therefore, the experiencer also contains the language or conceptual model of the world. Note that the experiencer contains 60% of the cortex of the brain. The thinker and doer share the frontal lobes of the brain. Since the frontal lobes include the primary and supplementary motor areas, along with Broca's area for language production, the thinker and doer agents can control the body and language output. The doer shares the cortex of the frontal lobes with the thinker. The doer is responsible for emotions and feelings, which are regulated by the ventral frontal cortex, along with some subcortical structures. In addition, the doer may use other subcortical structures for additional functions. The thinker and doer share 40% of the brain. This division between the frontal lobes and the rest of the brains is not absolute. The frontal lobes may contain some parts of the experiencer's current representation or model of the world, and some parts of the thinker or doer agents may be implemented in the parietal, temporal, or occipital lobes. For example, the representation of other people's emotions may use some of the emotional areas of the frontal lobes, and the representation of actions performed by others may use the mirror neurons in the primary motor areas of the frontal lobes. Therefore, some parts of the experiencer may be in the frontal lobes. Similarly, some functions of the thinker or doer may use some portions of the back three lobes of the brain. For example, the thinker's working memory may use parts of the parietal lobe. The experiencer may also share control of some muscles with the doer. For example, the muscles that control the eyes may be jointly controlled by the doer and experiencer. Now I will describe the three agents and their interfaces. I start with the human brain containing sensory and language inputs on the left and control of the body and language output on the right. I add the three agents, with the experiencer in the back of the brain and the thinker and doer sharing the frontal lobes of the brain. The experiencer gets both sensory and language input from the world. In the front of the brain, the doer is connected to and controls the body and produces language output. The doer is the agent that has basic goals set by evolution, and it also generates emotions and feelings. Note that emotions can have either a positive valence, such as love or happiness, or a negative valence, such as anger or sadness. Instead of using the terms positive valence emotion and negative valence emotion, I will just call them positive or negative emotions in the rest of this talk. The experiencer uses the sensory and language inputs to create the representation and models of the world and the body. There are, effectively, two different representations or models of the world, the body, and the self in the experiencer. The first is the sensory representation or model, and the second is the language or conceptual representation and model. Although I've just said that there are two different representations, there is a continuous hierarchy of categories from the raw sense data up to the concepts and symbols used by language. So it is more like a continuum with two endpoints, the sensory models and the language models being the endpoints. Because the doer and thinker share the frontal lobes, there is significant bidirectional information flow between these agents. There also has to be a relatively high capacity interface between the back and the front of the brain. So I assume that the global workspace is the interface that connects the experiencer with the thinker and doer. Bernard Baars proposed the global workspace concept, and Stan Dehane and his collaborators collected experimental evidence about this network that connects the back and the front of the brain during a conscious experience. The triangle in this brain is meant to represent a kind of funnel that connects the current experiencer world and body representations to the global workspace. The funnel aspect implies that only a small part of the continuous stream of sensory input data can make it through the global workspace to the thinker or doer. Thus, the global workspace is responsible for the spotlight of attention. For example, we can be vaguely aware of the entire visual field, but only be able to name and report on the object or objects that we are currently paying attention to, since that is all that can fit through the global workspace. In other words, the global workspace acts as a bottleneck for sensory experience. The doer and thinker control and direct the top-down attention of the experiencer. The doer must also inform the experiencer of any motor plans the doer will perform, since that will modify future expected sensory input. The experiencer on its own chooses the targets for bottom-up attention and brings this salient information to the attention of the frontal lobes. When the thinker is thinking its thoughts, the inner voice of these thoughts is communicated from the thinker to the experiencer. Finally, speech can either be automatic or thoughtful. Of course, the doer is the automatic agent that controls automatic speech, and the thinker controls the thoughtful speech. For example, if someone asks you a question and the experiencer has the answer immediately available in its language model of the world, the answer will be supplied to the doer to speak without involving the thinker at all. This is the automatic speech. Much of our daily back and forth conversations are probably of this automatic kind. If the experiencer does not have the answer available, then the thinker will get involved to solve the problem of figuring out the correct answer. This is thoughtful speech. The control of thoughtful speech by the thinker is one of the important features that separate humans from other animals and primates. In fact, this control of thoughtful speech could have been the evolutionary change that triggered the development of human language. Here is an example that demonstrates that chimpanzees do not have this thoughtful speech capability. Usually, when a chimpanzee finds a significant amount of fruit, the chimp will automatically emit a particular vocalization that alerts the entire troop so they can share the fruit. One time, Jane Goodall hid a bunch of bananas, and when a single chimp found the bananas, he quickly held his hand over his mouth in an attempt to prevent the automatic vocalization. Note that the chimp's thinker solved the problem of keeping all the fruit for himself, but he had to do it by putting his hand over his mouth, since the chimp's thinker could not control language output directly. It had no thoughtful speech capabilities. Part 2 discusses the cluster of conscious neurons concept. Let's start with the last word of that phrase, the neuron. The brain is composed of neurons that process signals. Here is a schematic drawing of a neuron that is connected to some other neurons. As you can see, a neuron has some similarities to a tree. The cell body is where the tree trunk enters the ground. The dendrites are the roots. The axon is the tree trunk and branches. The axon terminals are similar to leaves. And finally, the synapses are what connects the axon terminals to other trees, connecting to either the dendrites or the cell body of different neurons. Just as water in a tree travels from the roots through the trunk to the leaves, the signal in a neuron travels from the dendrites through the cell body, the axon, to the synapses, and then to the other neurons. The signal in neurons refers to an electrical and chemical pulse that travels from the dendrites to the axon to the synapses. When this pulse occurs, the neuron has fired. The neuron firing rate can vary from just a few times per second up to about 1,000 times per second. There are almost 100 billion neurons in a human brain. Each neuron can get signals from up to 10,000 other neurons and can send signals to up to 10,000 more neurons. There are, altogether, about 100 trillion synapses connecting those 100 billion neurons. So if you imagine all those neurons firing many times per second, you will see that a lot is going on in the brain. So, what do all those neurons and neuron firings do? Well, one mysterious thing they do is to somehow generate consciousness. Now, the word consciousness can have many meanings. For example, it can simply mean the difference between being awake versus being in a deep, dreamless sleep. Alternatively, consciousness can refer to simple awareness. The meaning of consciousness that I will be talking about in this presentation is about consciousness as awareness. We can be conscious or aware of many different kinds of things, such as sensory inputs, thoughts, emotions, feelings, and our actions. The brain also performs significant subconscious processing. In fact, most of the time, most of the brain is doing subconscious processing. For example, right now, please raise your hand and touch the back of your head. Done? Okay, now tell me, which muscles did you contract and in what order did you contract them to move your arm? I will bet you don't know. I certainly don't know. All that work of moving the body is done subconsciously by the brain. Priming is another example of subconscious processing. Psychologists perform priming experiments by presenting a word or an image to experimental subjects for a very short time. If the time is short enough, the subjects report no conscious awareness of a word or image at all. And yet, that word or image will have an influence on the answers the subject gives to subsequent questions. Thus, the subconsciously perceived word or image was in fact processed by the brain somehow and had an effect on future answers. These two examples are relatively simple cases, but the brain is also capable of quite complicated and sophisticated subconscious processing. For example, mathematicians and many others commonly report that they may work on a problem for a while without finding a solution. At some point, they stop working on the problem, and sometime later, the solution to the problem pops into their head, fully formed and fully worked out. All they have to do is write it down. This is a subconscious type of intuitive problem solving. This naturally brings up the question, which neurons do conscious versus subconscious processing in the brain? In 1990, Francis Crick and Christoph Koch proposed this question as a challenge to other neuroscientists. They called this the search for the neural correlates of consciousness, or NCC. This is the search to discover the neural events and mechanisms sufficient for consciousness. The events and mechanisms could, for example, refer to the firing rate of a neuron. The set of neurons needed by the NCC at a given time could be called the cluster of conscious neurons, or CCN for short. This phrase is used in the rest of this presentation to refer to all the neurons that are involved in the NCC when we are conscious. So the CCN is the cluster of neurons that are involved in creating the awareness that we experience as consciousness. All the other neurons in the brain are doing the subconscious processing. So, about the cluster of conscious neurons, one question to ask is, can the CCN be determined experimentally? For the past 20 years, many neuroscientists have been using many different techniques to try to answer that question. One example that I will refer to later is the work of Stan Dehane, who has determined several clusters of neurons in what he calls the global workspace. Stan has demonstrated that these clusters of neurons are required to have a conscious experience. Another question would be, is there a theory that could determine the CCN? There are not many full-fledged theories in neuroscience regarding this question, but there is one theory, Integrated Information, or IIT for short, that does purport to achieve this goal of identifying the neurons in the CCN. I will say more about IIT on the next slide. There are other ideas or hypotheses about the CCN. For example, there is the hypothesis that the CCN is the set of neurons that are firing synchronously together in the gamma frequency band. Gamma frequencies are measured in an EEG and are equivalent to neuron firing rates that are faster than about 40 firings per second. Is the CCN static or dynamic? Maybe the set of neurons in the CCN are completely static throughout our lifetime. However, since our experiences changes so dramatically from second to second, it is unlikely the CCN is completely static. Indeed, both IIT and the synchronous gamma firing hypothesis imply the CCN is very dynamic. Does the CCN depend on the activity and the connectivity of the neurons? Both IIT and the synchronous gamma firing hypothesis imply the CCN depends on both the activity and the connectivity of the neurons. To explain enlightenment, this consciousness model needs the CCN to be dynamic and to depend on the activity and connectivity of the neurons. Integrated information theory is a neuroscientific theory that satisfies both of these needs. So now I turn to integrated information theory. IIT is a neuroscientific theory that can determine the cluster of conscious neurons. IIT has a very difficult to calculate, complicated mathematical formula for computing the amount of integrated information in a cluster of neurons. The formula is so complex that it is entirely impractical to try to compute this formula for even a tiny brain. For a very large human brain, it would be physically impossible to calculate the formula. Perhaps someone someday will invent a way to experimentally determine the CCN. The significance of IIT is that, in principle, there is a way to identify the CCN. Ignoring the difficulty of the calculation problem, let's see what the implications of IIT would be for the three-agent model of spirituality and enlightenment. In the rest of this presentation, I will use the symbol phi to represent the amount of integrated information in a given neuron cluster. The key idea of IIT is that, for a given system, the cluster of neurons with the globally maximum phi value will be the cluster of conscious neurons. For example, consider this rectangle to represent the entire human brain with sensory inputs on the left and motor outputs on the right. The CCN could be this neuron cluster with the globally maximum phi value. For the CCN, the phi value will decrease if you either add or remove neurons from the CCN. Therefore, the cluster of neurons has a locally maximum phi value. There may be other clusters with a locally maximum phi value. Among all the clusters with a locally maximum phi value, there will always be some cluster which has the globally maximum phi value. So for this brain at this time, let's assume that the cluster is the globally maximum phi value. IIT would then say that this is the one and only CCN in the brain. However, as I said, there may be other clusters which have a locally maximum phi value, such as this cluster. Since this locally maximum phi value is less than the globally maximum phi value, this will be a subconscious neuron cluster. The phi value for a neuron cluster will depend on the connectivity of the neurons, and it will also rely on the current state of the neurons in that cluster. Therefore, the exact boundaries of the current CCN could change rapidly as the activity of the neurons change. And there could also be slower long-term changes as the connectivity of the neurons change due to neuroplasticity. The model I am presenting here does not depend on the exact calculation of the amount of integrated information in IIT. In fact, if IIT is incorrect and some other theory determines the CCN in a different way, this model can just substitute this new theory in place of IIT. For example, if IIT is wrong, and if the CCN is the set of neurons in the brain which are firing synchronously in the gamma band of EEG frequencies, then this model of consciousness and enlightenment could work just as well with that gamma synchrony theory substituted for IIT. Now, part 3, about spirituality and spiritual enlightenment. I will discuss what is the problem that spirituality solves, what is enlightenment, what are some of the properties of enlightenment. I'll start with the question, what is the problem that spirituality and spiritual enlightenment solves? The answer is that the problem is the thinker. No, not that thinker. I'm talking about the thinker in your brain. The thinker which is ideal for developing civilization, science, and technology, and to help us achieve goals. The problem is that this thinker is not good at living a happy life. In particular, the thinker finds problems everywhere. This can lead to a negative critical attitude towards life. Nobody likes a complainer, and when the thinker finds problems everywhere, is necessarily complaining about everything. In fact, to the thinker, if there is no problem, then that is a problem. So the thinker will find an old problem or invent a new problem. If the thinker cannot locate a problem right here and now, it will go to the past or the future to find a problem to fix. The thinker argues with reality with thoughts like, this should not happen, or this is bad and wrong, or I should not have done that. Any judgment about reality is essentially arguing with reality. Obviously, negative judgments, like the ones listed here, are arguing with reality. However, even positive judgments argue with reality. For example, judgments like, this situation is good, implies that if the situation did not occur, it would be bad. This can lead to an experiencer model of the world filled with contradictions. If the experiencer incorporates these judgmental thoughts into its language or conceptual model of the world, then the language model of the world will disagree with the sensory model of the world. The language model will say, this should not happen, and the sensory model will represent that this did happen. The result is a world model which is inconsistent or contradictory. More about the thinker problem. The thinker thinks that negative emotions are a problem for the thinker to solve. If something happens that triggers a negative emotion like sadness, the thinker asks, how do I prevent this from happening again? Alternatively, depending on the circumstances, it might ask, how do I get back at that person who hurt me? Positive emotions can also be a problem for the thinker to solve. When something good happens that leads to happiness, the thinker asks, how do I make sure this happens all the time? When the thinker realizes that it may not be able to maintain this happy state continuously, the positive emotion can be replaced by fear or worry about when and how the positive emotion might end. Thus, positive emotions can be turned into negative emotions such as fear or worry by the thinker. When there is no current problem to solve, the thinker may start looking around for a problem somewhere, and that problem can be in the past, often called a resentment. Alternatively, that problem can be in the future, usually triggering fears. From all of this, you can see that the thinker is an emotion amplifier and an emotion echo chamber. The thinker amplifies negative emotions and is an echo chamber that can continue to obsess about a problem again and again for a long time. Resentments, for example, can last for years or a lifetime. Buddhism says that the cause of suffering is attachments and aversions. Attachments and aversions involve some positive or negative emotion or feeling, and therefore the thinker also amplifies attachments and aversions. Now I turn to enlightenment. The word non-duality is said to be a synonym for enlightenment. Non-dual literally means not two, one. So to what does this not two, one apply? The answer is essentially everything. For example, in non-duality, it is said that the subject-object distinction falls away since there is not two, one. This implies the world and I are one, because an object could be anything in the world, and the subject is I. So, what is enlightenment? Unfortunately, there is no scientific, rigorous research to guide us to an answer to this question. However, there are numerous religious and spiritual traditions that either explicitly or implicitly talk about something like enlightenment or non-duality. There's also much mythology and misinformation about enlightenment out there. For example, there are claims that an enlightened person will never have bad thoughts, angry emotions, and never harm others, that they will attain some kind of perfection. However, I claim that enlightenment is not about any sort of perfection. Enlightened people are still human, and as long as humans are messy biological organisms, we cannot become perfect. For more information about why enlightenment is not about perfection, see Daniel Ingram's discussion of 31 different models of enlightenment. Daniel Ingram's book, Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, is a very accessible modern survey of many of the various practices and sects of Buddhism written by an emergency room doctor who claims to have achieved a high level of enlightenment through his Buddhist practice. He discusses many different perfectionist models of enlightenment, such as having perfect thoughts or perfect emotions, and he rejects them all. The only model he endorses fully is the non-duality model, where the enlightened person perceives non-duality directly. In Buddhism, non-duality is achieved by attaining the insight that the sense of a permanent I is an illusion. If Ingram is correct that non-duality is an essential part of enlightenment, then that implies that enlightenment is a different kind of perception of the world, and it requires a fundamental change in the self-model of the human. A normal, modern human would never say that the world and I are one. The perceptions of the world and I are entirely different. It would require a radical change in the perception of the world and a fundamental shift in the self-model to allow them to be seen as one and the same thing. In a few more slides, I will explain how these changes of perception of the world and self can follow from this model of consciousness. Additionally, there is evidence that there are multiple kinds of enlightenment. For example, Bernadette Roberts reports having two different kinds of enlightenment many years apart. Roberts is a former Catholic contemplative nun who first experienced enlightenment when her self became unified with her God at age 19. Many years later, all sense of self entirely dropped away when she entered what she called the no-self state of enlightenment. Daniel Ingram documents that various sects of Buddhism claim between 2 and 10 different stages or paths of enlightenment. For example, in Theravada Buddhism, there are 4 levels of enlightenment that start with stream entry and ends with arhat. Daniel Ingram, for example, claims that he is an arhat. So to be successful, this model of consciousness and enlightenment must account for multiple levels of enlightenment. Now I'll turn to a discussion of some commonly reported properties of enlightenment. First of all, this is not a universally accepted list. Since there are multiple kinds of enlightenment, each person or spiritual tradition thinks that their particular form of enlightenment is the one and only real kind of enlightenment. So there will be some disagreements about the items I will discuss here. However, in each case, I claim that multiple people or traditions do report these particular items as being legitimate properties of enlightenment. As I've already said, non-duality is the most important property. Another common report is non-agency, which means that there is no sense that they are doing actions. There are reports of simultaneous awareness of the whole visual field and continuous awareness of the entire body. They also state the experience of substantially decreased thoughts, especially self-centered thoughts. Some people would go so far as to claim 0 thoughts. There are also reports of substantially decreased emotions, especially negative emotions, leaving mostly positive ones. Again, some people would go so far as to claim 0 emotions or feelings. When there are residual emotions, they can manifest mostly as a sense of love or acceptance of everyone and everything. Next, Part 4, Combining Ideas. By combining IIT and the 3-agent model, we can explain the purpose of spiritual practices and spiritual awakening, multiple different kinds of enlightenment or non-duality, and the properties of different enlightened or non-dual states. The key idea here is that all of these are explained by the way the cluster of conscious neurons distributes itself among the 3 agents. Consider the 3-agent model. For a given CCN, we can list which agent or agents contain the CCN. If something causes significant changes in the boundary of the CCN, then, when the list of agents changes, some transition to or from an enlightened state will occur. How is the CCN distributed among the 3 agents? The normal modern human would have a CCN mostly in the thinker and the experiencer. Dual process theory says the thinker is conscious. This claim is also consistent with Standa Haynes' work on global workspace, which found that for the thinker to report that it is conscious of a sensory experience, the sensory impression must activate the global workspace. Assuming that the experiencer is the agent that is aware of sensory experiences, it is reasonable to claim that the thinker, the global workspace, and the experiencer must contain the CCN for this kind of reportable conscious sensory experience. Note that in this modern human, whatever the doer does will be subconscious, since none of the CCN will be in the doer. This explains why so much of what we do in life is essentially subconscious. The spiritually enlightened or non-dual states would have a CCN mostly in the doer and/or the experiencer. This will naturally result in quite a different experience of consciousness, since there is no CCN in the thinker. Because the CCN now includes much of the doer, a significantly increased awareness of the body will be experienced. The most non-dual enlightened state would have a CCN confined to the experiencer only. The doer shares some attributes with the thinker. They both have goals and do things in the world to achieve those goals. However, when the CCN is only in the experiencer, there will be no experience of agency because the experiencer does not do anything to the world. The primary goal the experiencer has is to create an accurate sensory and conceptual model of the world and the body. The self-model of the experiencer is also quite a bit different than the thinker and doer self-model, as we will see in the next slide. The three agent self-models. An agent needs to have a model of the world, and since humans and the three agents are part of the world, the agent needs to have a model of itself, its self-model. The thinker's self-model is I or me, the autobiographical narrative history of me, my goals, my body, my emotions, and feelings. By the way, I am aware of the world, and I make all the decisions, and I am in total control of my body. So the thinker's self-model is a very complicated model. The doer's self-model is the body, emotions, feelings, and goals. Moreover, the doer is capable of controlling the body and perceiving the world. Although the thinker's and doer's models are similar, the doer's self-model is much simpler than the thinker's self-model. The experiencer's self-model is entirely different. I claim that the best words to describe the experiencer's self-model are the words presence awareness. Some non-dual teachers, such as John Wheeler, say that the answer to the question, who am I, is presence awareness. Rather, I should say that these two words are just a language pointer to the actual nonverbal experience of a genuine answer to the question, who am I? So the true non-dual answer to who am I needs to be experienced. The language label of presence awareness is just a pointer to that experience. The actual name experiencer is, perhaps, unfortunate, since that word makes it sound like the experiencer is a noun. A Buddhist would say that who I am, at a fundamental level, is not a noun. In other words, I am not an observer, and I am not an experiencer. Rather, the Buddhist would say that fundamentally, who I am is observing or experiencing, i.e. the name experiencer should be a verb instead of a noun. Let's look at presence awareness more closely. Presence is simply the sense of existence or beingness. In other words, the experiencer's self-model, whatever it is, does exist. Moreover, awareness is simply the perception of the body, the world, the thoughts, and the feelings. Thus, both thoughts and feelings are perceived by the experiencer, since they do not originate in the experiencer itself. Note that perception of the world and the body results in an internal experiencer representation of essentially everything in the physical world. Thus, if presence means I exist, then presence awareness is something like I exist as the entire physical world. In other words, the world and I are one. The key idea here is that the reason why the self-models of the agents are important is that when the CCN contains most of an agent, the self-model of the CCN will match the self-model of the agent. In other words, if I am contained in an agent, then who I am is that agent's self-model, since that is whom the agent thinks he is. The presumption is that the information contained in the CCN will be a representation of some salient content about the current state of the world. If that content happens to include something about the agent symbol for me, then that will implicitly refer to the self-model of the agent that contains the CCN. Note that this happens automatically and almost by definition. For an agent, a symbol like me is simply a symbolic reference to the agent itself. In other words, a reference to its self-model. If the CCN includes multiple agents, the CCN self-model will be the union or amalgam of the different models of the agents it contains. However, as you can see, these self-models are largely supersets of each other. The doer and thinker self-model implicitly includes the experiencer self-model, and the thinker self-model implicitly includes the doer self-model. Thus, if the CCN involves the thinker at all, then the CCN me is the thinker self-model. Similarly, if the CCN includes the doer but not the thinker, then the CCN's me is the doer self-model. Finally, for the CCN me to be the experiencer self-model, the CCN cannot include either the doer or the thinker. So you can see that when the CCN is completely within the experiencer, the CCN self-model will be substantially different than when the CCN includes either the doer or the thinker. How does spirituality help solve the thinker problem? First of all, spiritual practices can give us an insight that we are more than just the thinker. For example, the doer or experiencer can be recognized as the soul or as our connection to a God. At some point during human evolution, perhaps somewhere around 50,000 years ago, the CCN may have moved from the doer to the thinker. Note that humans were anatomically modern for about 200,000 years. Thus, the frontal lobes had increased to their current size by 200,000 years ago. However, it was only somewhere around 50,000 years ago that we developed behavioral modernity. Behavioral modernity includes traits like advanced blade technology, organized hunting of large game, art, ornamentation, and music, along with abstract thinking and detailed planning. Thus, 50,000 years ago would be approximately the time when the slowly increasing language vocabulary and slowly growing cultural language model of the world crossed some threshold that allowed the thinker to contain the CCN for the first time. Up until that time, the CCN was in the doer, even though the thinker's brain hardware had been available for 150,000 years. So it was a software upgrade that allowed the thinker to become the conscious agent. This upgrade was caused by the slowly accumulating, culturally propagated language model of the world taught to each new generation by parents and the community. When the thinker first became the CCN, the thinker may have misidentified the subconscious doer and experiencer as the God agent. The newly conscious and weaker thinker at that time may have been more aware of the conscious doer and experiencer who were previously dominant and conscious. The thinker may have interpreted those agents as being stronger than the new thinker and may have misidentified them as God. In fact, the story of Adam and Eve's fall from grace and from Eden, caused by eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, may be an allegory for the time when the thinker became the CCN. In particular, notice that the thinker often judges things as being either good or evil, and that the fall from paradise could represent the additional suffering that Adam and Eve experienced by having the new thinker be the conscious agent for the first time. In fact, the Catholic Church's concept of original sin could be the sin of having a conscious thinker. Some spiritual paths recommend trusting intuition as being God's communication to us, and intuition comes from the doer and experiencer. There is much wisdom in the doer and experiencer, so trusting intuition is sometimes an excellent idea. In fact, it is possible that there is a distinction between instinct and intuition. Instinct could be a behavioral suggestion recommended by the doer, whereas intuition could be a new understanding about the world that was generated by the experiencer. After all, you must understand the world to create a good model of the world, and the experiencer is all about building a good model of the world. Forgiveness and acceptance can mitigate resentments caused by the thinker trying to solve problems in the past. My favorite wisdom saying is that forgiveness is giving up all hope of a better past. As long as the thinker is trying to solve the problem of making the past better, we will continue to have resentments. When the thinker gives up solving the past problem and accepts the past exactly the way it is, we will have forgiven our transgressor. Trusting God or a higher power can mitigate fear caused by the thinker trying to solve problems in the future. The thinker can worry and obsess about how to solve future problems, which leads to fear and anxiety. If God is the misidentified doer and experiencer, then trusting that the doer and experiencer can handle the future problems if and when they occur will mitigate that fear. How does enlightenment help solve the thinker problem? Before enlightenment, the CCN includes most of the thinker. Therefore, the CCN self-model is the thinker self-model. All these problem-solving thoughts are our thoughts. And all these problems to solve are our problems. After enlightenment, the CCN does not include the thinker. Therefore, the thinker self-model can be seen to not be me. The thinker's thoughts are not my thoughts. All these problems the thinker is solving are not my problems. The thinker may still have attachments and aversions, but they are not my attachments and aversions. Now let's look at the original diagram of the three agents in a human so we can graphically see some of the various ways to distribute the CCN among the three agents. Let's start by considering the case of a non-human animal's brain. In particular, let's look at the animal's CCN state. First of all, notice that there is no language, model of the world, body, or self in a non-human animal. There still can be concepts, but these concepts are only the ones that are discovered by the particular animal during its lifetime. The advantage that humans have with language is that we can quickly learn and incorporate many concepts that have accumulated in our culture over millennia. Instead of having language input and output, we have auditory input and output, and the only auditory output is automatically generated by the doer. There is no thoughtful auditory output by the thinker. Also notice the thinker is weaker, partly due to the lack of a language model of the world, and partly due to an animal's smaller frontal lobes. The CCN in this case would be located in the doer and experiencer. The CCN is the neuron cluster with the globally maximum phi value, where that phi value measures the amount of integrated information in the neuron cluster. No other neuron cluster has a bigger phi value, but it may also be the case that no other neuron cluster even has a significant locally maximum phi value. So this may be all there is to see regarding the phi value neuron cluster of an animal. Moreover, this diagram would also apply to the case of very early humans, of course. Now we consider the case of the modern human CCN state. We are back to the modern human brain with the extensive language models and with the language input and output capabilities and with thoughtful speech. The hypothesis is that the CCN would be in the thinker and experiencer. This means that the conscious self-model of the modern human would be the very complicated self-model of the thinker. Because of our animal heritage, there could be a locally maximum phi value neuron cluster in the doer. But the phi value of this neuron cluster would be much lower than the thinker's phi value. According to integrated information theory, this means that only the thinker is conscious. So whatever integrated information is contained in the doer neuron cluster will not be conscious to us modern humans. This doer subconscious neuron cluster can account for some of the motor responses to subconscious sensory inputs that humans demonstrate. For example, the subconscious doer neuron cluster can account for phenomena such as blind sight and priming. Blind sight is the ability of some people who are cortically blind to respond to visual stimuli that they do not consciously perceive. Priming is an effect in which exposure to a subconsciously perceived stimulus influences response to a later stimulus. In fact, this subconscious doer is also responsible for our automatic speech, which is a large part of all of our speech output. There is evidence, in some cases, that we are not conscious of what we say until we hear what we say. Just as an aside, consider the unusual case where these two neuron clusters merge into one. This could describe the CCN of the flow state. If the thinker and doer concentrate entirely on just one particular task, it could mean that the contents of the two separate neuron clusters are representing the same object or objects. This could cause the temporary merger of the two different islands of maximum phi value into a larger globally maximum phi value that becomes the CCN. Thus, in the normal non-flow state modern human, it may be that the thinker and doer do not concentrate on the same task at all. If the doer is doing almost all the work of the current task, the thinker could be bored and be off trying to find some other more interesting problem to solve. Alternatively, if the thinker is very busy solving the problem demanded by the current task, the doer may be in idle mode with nothing to do. The doer is probably much more comfortable with doing nothing than the thinker ever is at doing nothing, Thinkers get bored when there is nothing to do. So we would only get the flow state when both the doer and thinker are fully occupied trying to solve the same problem which has triggered this flow state CCN. So if your thinker is bored right now, let's go back to the modern human CCN. The thinker's phi value may decrease from doing spiritual practices like forgiveness and acceptance. Forgiveness takes away some of the thinker's favorite problems, and acceptance mutes the thinker's complaints. Similarly, meditation where thoughts are allowed to dissipate naturally could also decrease the thinker's phi value. Notice that the opposite of thoughts dissipating naturally are obsessions where we tightly hold on to thoughts. Similarly, yoga or meditation using body scanning could increase the doer's phi value. Another useful kind of meditation would be a noting practice where the meditator quickly notes the bottom-up attention sensations that are always arising in the experiencer. The result of all this is that we might have the beginning of enlightenment. This is the case where the phi values of the thinker and doer are comparable. In this situation, the CCN could rapidly switch between the doer and the thinker. This could have positive consequences of significantly limiting the average amount of suffering that the thinker can cause, since the thinker would not be able to get stuck in obsessive loops. Negative emotions are much more transient, since there are frequent short circuits of the thinker's emotion amplifier and emotion echo chamber functions. If we continue with the spiritual practices, and if the trends of decreasing thinker phi value and increasing doer phi value continue, we would reach the first enlightened CCN state. This resembles the animal CCN, but is entirely different. The highly capable human thinker is much stronger than the weak animal thinker, and the human brain has language. The enlightened human has the full power of the enormous language and conceptual model of the world, body, and self at its disposal. So if we are in this stable CCN state, thinking is still possible, but I am just not the thinker. So becoming enlightened doesn't mean we are incapable of thinking or solving problems. We may not be as interested in solving problems, but we can still solve problems when needed. In this state, there will be much less negative emotion, since the thinker is the amplifier of negative emotion, and the thinker can also turn a positive emotion into a negative emotion with its worry about the possible ending of the positive emotion. To change who am I into the experiencer self-model, we would have to continue some spiritual practices that will decrease the portion of the CCN in the doer agent. This could lead to an early non-dual CCN state. Here, the vast majority of the CCN is in the experiencer, so the overall self-model would likely be the simpler experiencer's self-model. The next stage could be a fully non-dual CCN state. Here, the CCN is contained entirely within the experiencer. The person in this state would still experience the world and the body, but the person's sense of self becomes the very simple experiencer self-model of presence awareness. As we said, even though the experiencer completely contains the CCN, that does not prevent the thinker and doer from continuing to do whatever the thinker and doer choose to do. In particular, if the thinker and doer perform selfish and self-centered acts, which have the potential to do harm to other people, they may still continue to do those acts even after the fully non-dual enlightened state is achieved. In his book, Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, on page 24, Daniel Ingram reports that the training in morality or virtue is both the first and the last training. The second training is in concentration, and the third training is on insight. If mastering the first three trainings achieves enlightenment, and if the training in morality or virtue is both the first and last training, then the implication is that even enlightened people need to continue with the last training on morality or virtue. In other words, an enlightened person needs to continue to train the thinker and doer to be less selfish and self-centered, so the enlightened person can live a virtuous and moral life. Notice that the last 4 slides presented 4 different kinds or stages of enlightenment. Obviously, there could be many more variations for each of these slides, since the exact proportion of the CCN in each of the 3 agents could vary quite a bit, and could even vary dynamically in time. so we can easily explain multiple kinds of enlightened states. We previously had listed some of the commonly reported properties of enlightenment. Now we look at how the fully non-dual CCN state explains those properties. Explaining enlightenment properties in the fully non-dual CCN state. Remember that in the transition to the fully non-dual state, the CCN self-model changes from the thinker self-model to the experiencer self-model. Also remember that the most important property of enlightenment is non-duality. The explanation of non-duality is that the CCN self-model is the experiencer self-model, and that self-model is essentially the same as the model of the world and the body. Thus the distinction between the subject, the self, and the object, the world, has disappeared, and therefore the world and I are one in this state. Non-agency. The experiencer does not do any actions. Both the thinker and doer have a sense of agency since they do things in the world. In fact, the thinker has an inflated sense of agency since it thinks it does everything, even though the doer is the agent that does most of the actions of living. However, the experiencer only constructs an accurate sense and language model of the world and body, so it does not really do anything in the world. Hence, the experiencer does not have a feeling or sense of agency. The bottleneck of the global workspace explains increased awareness of the whole visual field and body. If the entire CCN is in the experiencer, then the sensory input does not have to go through the bottleneck of the global workspace. This means the experiencer can simultaneously be aware of the entire visual field and the whole body. There are reports of substantially decreased thoughts because the experiencer is not the thinker. Some fully non-dual people report virtually no self-referential thoughts. Decreased self-referential thoughts are understandable since the thinker self-model is not the self-model of the experiencer, or CCN, so whatever I or me the thinker is talking about is not who I am. However, other fully non-dual people report that even though there are still thoughts, they do not experience those thoughts as being their thoughts. The thoughts are just like any other sensory input that may or may not be meaningful in a given situation. Substantially decreased emotions because the experiencer is not the doer. Some fully non-dual people report virtually no emotions or feelings at all. However, other fully non-dual people report that there are still emotions, but there are less of them. They also report they do not experience those emotions as being their emotions. It is more like the emotions are just like any other sensory experience that may or may not be meaningful in a given situation. It makes sense that the emotions are not their emotions since the CCN is not the doer. Since the experiencer cannot argue with reality, it will accept the world exactly the way it is. The trigger for many negative emotions is the thinker arguing with reality. As long as the experiencer does not believe the thinker's thoughts that argue with reality, the experiencer will not have to try to represent a contradictory model of the world. In fact, the experiencer by itself totally and completely accepts the world the way it is now, the way it was in the past, and the way it might be in the future. Thus, the experiencer can achieve its goals of modeling the world, and that makes it a happy agent. The experiencer accepts the world and is happy with the world the way it is, since its only goal is to represent and model the world exactly the way it is. However, the thinker and doer have goals which would require them to make changes in the world to satisfy those goals. Note that this happiness is not the same kind of limbic happiness that the doer generates. The doer happiness depends on the circumstances of the world, but the experiencer happiness is not contingent on anything in the world. Rather, it's like the happiness of a 100% successful agent, so a better word for it might be satisfactoriness. Finally, I'll end with some predictions. The first prediction is that a fully non-dual human should be able to consciously detect masked images presented too fast for normal humans. In priming experiments in psychology or cognitive science, a word is flashed on the screen for a brief period with continuously changing masked images of rectangles presented on screen both before and after the word is flashed. Normal subjects do not see a word presented for less than about 65 milliseconds. However, the invisible word can still prime the subject to answer some questions with a reply related to the invisible flashed priming word. This priming effect is evidence for the doer having a higher bandwidth connection to the experiencer than the thinker. The doer neuron cluster is not conscious to us, but it does contain the masked word for a long enough time to influence the word choices for the question that occurs later. This prediction is that when the CCN is entirely within the experiencer, the enlightened person should be able to consciously perceive words presented for much less than 65 milliseconds. The reasoning is that the briefly flashed word does not have to make it all the way to the thinker through the global workspace bottleneck. Therefore, its representation can ignite the CCN and persist in the CCN for a long enough time to allow the thinker to use the global workspace interface to receive and accurately report the identity of the word. The next item is not a prediction, since the fact has already been observed by meditators, but this model does explain why open monitoring meditation practices are more effective at producing enlightenment than focused attention meditation. FA meditation requires the thinker or doer to actively direct and redirect top-down attention to the object of meditation. On the other hand, OM meditation is relying on bottom-up attention of the experiencer to automatically choose the object of meditation to be reported or noted by the thinker or doer. Therefore, FA will continue to reinforce the necessity of the thinker or doer, whereas OM depends mostly on the experiencer. The FA meditation's use of the thinker or doer will strengthen neural connections to those agents, which would encourage the CCN to continue to include those agents. This does not say that FA meditation is never appropriate. For a novice meditator, FA is useful. It helps the thinker learn the FA discipline of keeping top-down attention on the meditation object. Otherwise, the thinker is quickly bored by meditation and may end up going off to find a more interesting problem to solve in the past or the future. This also explains the observation that doing OM quickly should also increase effectiveness. If the noting of bottom-up attention is too fast for the thinker to keep up with, then the thinker becomes even less involved. The second prediction of this model is that a new kind of bottom-up attention meditation, triggered by technology-generated alternating sensations, should be effective for achieving enlightenment. This meditation uses one sensory modality to trigger bottom-up attention in a different modality. The idea is that this technique could effectively increase the neural connections between these different sensory modalities. Rapidly triggering bottom-up attention could also induce additional neural connections. Hopefully, more neural connections in the sensory cortex will increase the potential amount of integrated information. This could make it more likely for the CCN to be contained entirely by the experiencer and thus lead to the fully non-dual CCN state. For example, to combine hearing with the body sensation modality, we've used a set of stereo audio files containing metronome tick-tock sounds, with the ticks in one ear and the tocks in the other ear. This diagram shows that the idea is to start the tick-tocks at a slow rate like 1 tick per second, then gradually speed up to a higher rate like 2, 4, 10, or even 20 ticks per second, and finally to gradually slow them down again to 1 tick per second, all within a minute or so. One way to do this meditation could be to listen to a playlist of tracks like this with varying top tick rates. The instruction would be to use the audio tick-tocks to be the triggers to direct body sensation attention to the right or left hand in synchrony with the ticks or tocks being heard in the right or left ear. Specifically for a right ear tick, direct attention to the right hand, and for a left ear tock, direct attention to the left hand. Of course, this is not limited to hands. Any bilateral body part is appropriate. When at a low tick rate, the thinker or doer will be using top-down attention to keep the right-left body sensation attention synchronized with the auditory right-left ticks. This part of the meditation trains the experiencer on the kind of bottom-up attention that is needed. As the tick rate increases, the thinker or doer will not be able to keep up, so only the experiencer will be able to keep the bottom-up body sensation attention synchronized with the auditory tick-tock input. Another similar technique could be used to connect hearing and vision. The instruction is to keep the eyes focal visual attention fixed on a single object straight ahead, and then to alternate peripheral visual attention to objects on the right or left of the focal attention object, as the ticks are heard in the right or left ear respectively. To use body sensation modality, we could use computer-controlled vibrating devices on either the left or right hand as the sensory inputs. With these devices, we could connect the body sensation modality with peripheral visual attention. When we feel a right or left vibrating body sensation, we could direct peripheral visual attention to the right or left. Reversing the direction in these two sensory modalities, we could have a small light flashing in the right or left visual field and use that to direct body sensation attention to the right or left. Given a few months of this technology-driven meditation practice, an increased awareness of the whole visual field and greater awareness of the entire body sensation field would indicate progress. This increased sensory perception would be evidence for the CCN changing in the direction of only being present in the experiencer. I look forward to experiments using this new meditation technique to see if it is successful at inducing enlightenment. That's the end of the talk. I would very much appreciate any and all thoughts and feedback. I would also like to thank all of your thinkers out there for directing your top-down attention to this talk. Either leave a comment here on YouTube or send a comment or question in an email to consciousness@frankhiley.com. Also, let me know if you would like an occasional email when new kinds of content such as talks, videos, articles, or my book are available. Please feel free to email links or to use social media to share this video with any of your friends who might be interested in this subject. Hello,